Creating patterns in Illustrator. So a pattern is basically a design that can fill an object or stroke objects. And we save patterns in our swatches panel. We'll find them right here. There are a few that come preloaded with Illustrator. So how do we create a pattern? What we need to do is create our artwork that we would like to use as our pattern fill or pattern stroke. So if I do something basic here, let me make an ellipse. I'll turn it into a perfect circle by holding the Shift key. And then let's put a star in it. And again, I'll go and I'll drag with my Alt key, so I drag out from the center. If I hold Shift, I'm able to constrain and control my orientation here. Let up on my mouse, then let up on my Alt and my Shift key. And I'll put a fill in here, with my fill being on the top. And I'll make a stroke of none. Go to my selection tool, deselect. So here's the pattern maybe that I want to do. Let's go ahead and make this not as harsh. Let's turn the stroke and let's thicken the stroke up at the top so we can maybe see this a bit better. I'm going to darken this just a little bit. So oops. Okay. Now we can just see it a little bit better. So to define a pattern, basically after creating the artwork that you want to use for the pattern, you just select all of those components and drag it into the swatches panel. And you can see I get a thumbnail here with my pattern swatch. If I double click on it, I get a dialog box here that will control editing. We'll talk about that later, but I can also name it if I would like. So I'll name my pattern a star. Let's close that and done. That's kind of an editing thing. And now what I happen to do is already apply that to my previous stroke. Let's just select this and delete it. Okay, so now that we have defined our pattern, let's apply it. Before we do that, a couple of pieces or information that you should know when you're defining a pattern. So what can we use and what can we not use when we're doing a pattern? So I can use paths, so that means I can actually, use lines. I could put a linear kind of pattern with just a bunch of different lines. I can use compound paths. Remember, we do those under the object menu and compound path. And I can use text. So I could use the type tool here and apply some text and define that as part of my pattern. What I cannot use a gradient. I cannot use a blend, a brush strokes, meshes, bitmap images. So those are the images that we do a file in place and bring in or import. We cannot use those. We cannot use graphs. We have a graphing tool in Illustrator, but we cannot use those right here. We cannot use masks, and we cannot use other patterns, so they can't be embedded inside one another. So after we've defined this pattern, and we'll do a few more here in a minute, but let's go back to the star with the circle. So to apply it, I basically need to create a container for that. So I'll just use a rectangle tool and draw out a square rectangle-ish shape. Okay, right now I have a fill of none and a stroke of red. Let's turn that stroke to black so you can see the definition of the outside of this box. Okay, and now when I bring my fill to the front, if I want to fill this with my pattern, I just click the pattern swatch in swatches and it's applied. Now a couple of things. What happens is patterns repeat. And so it does this by tiling, and it's just a complete analogy to a tile on a floor. So it's just, if you were to tile your kitchen floor, you put one tile right next to another in a grid type pattern, and that's exactly what patterns do in Illustrator as well. What we have is a bounding box though, and that's used to define the perimeter of the tile. So how do we control it? Well, what's interesting is that it's filled in this object, but now watch as I drag this box, my pattern does not move. My container moves, and it's as though I'm looking through a window at my pattern. So what we have to know is that the pattern and how we fill our objects acts like almost a clipping mask. If you can think of how clipping masks work and we have a window where we see through, that's exactly how a pattern works. Okay? And it covers the pattern. Think of it as covering the entire artboard, and only where I have my object here do I see my pattern. Now, if I wanted to do a little bit of editing here, I can say I want to scale my object. Let's just go to my scale tool, double click on it. Remember when we talked about transformations, I made note and said there are some options here that affect my attributes, and that's exactly what we're doing right now. So at the bottom here I have transform objects, or I have transform patterns. So it does exactly as you would think. I can transform only my objects, and if I do that, let's do this 50%, and I'm just going to do a preview here, so press tab. You can see what happened. My container or my square was scaled 50%, but nothing happened to my pattern. If I check pattern, now I just scaled my objects and I scaled my pattern. If I uncheck objects, I've now scaled my pattern but left my object. So I can have 3 choices here on how I want to apply any of my transformations. Now, when I do this, note that when you do a transform on a pattern, all additional objects that I fill with that pattern will have that. It's one of those sticky commands. So to return to sort of a default state, what I would need to do, let me just show you, I guess, by clicking and dragging, you can see that everything I create here now has that scaled down pattern. So to get rid of that or set it to the default, basically you just need to fill with another color and then go back and fill with your pattern, and it resets it. So it goes back to the default non-transformed appearance. Now, one note, we do have some additional features that Illustrator offers us for editing, but if you're defining a pattern where you want to have some space around it. Let's just try this type of, again, where I make a circle. Hold down my shift key to make a perfect circle. I'm going to apply just a simple fill here, and let's just do a couple additional circles. We'll do just one over here where you can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so if I were to define this as a pattern right now, I select both objects, drag it into my swatches, it defines it. And if I'm going to slide this off into my scratch area. This is typically what you'd want to do if you wanted to edit later on. And I'm going to make a rectangle here and fill it with this pattern. What happens is it gets tight. And if I were to redefine this, let's get rid of this and only define it as being a circle, and now fill it with just that circle pattern. Do you see how it's right next to one another? It's tight. It doesn't give you any space. So if I wanted to go back to my circle with my littler circle, let's bring this back onto the artboard so you can see this. And I wanted to have more space around it. What I need to do is make a container, basically a rectangle in the back, and it has to be at the back of the stacking order. So I'm going to have to right click on this, range it. I'm going to send it all the way to the back. And the other thing with this box, it cannot have a fill and it cannot have a stroke. So I'm going to do stroke and fill of none. So I don't see it when it's not selected, but when I drag to select, I see it. And now, oops, I lost my swatches. Let's drag this, making sure I have my container around the outside as well, into my swatches panel to define yet a third pattern. Let's put this off into my scratch area for later and make another container. Let's make a big large one here. And now apply this third. Oops, I did it to the stroke. Let's go and make my fill be in the front. Always have to pay attention. What's on front, fill or stroke? And there you see that now I have all of this extra space because it's defined by that invisible, really rectangle or square that I put at the bottom of the stack. So that helps define the boundaries of my pattern. So that's how we create simple patterns in Illustrator. Play with them. They can save you a lot of time.